Welcome back to CBS This Morning. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is apologizing to Indigenous Canadians after the remains of more than 200 Indigenous children were found last week. Some were as young as 3. Many from Indigenous communities gathered this week to honor the lives lost. The remains were discovered in Kamloops, British Columbia, at what was once Canada's largest residential school for Indigenous children. Our national correspondent Jerika Duncan spoke with a survivor. Jerika, good morning.
Good morning. This is such a dark chapter of history for Canada that needs to be told. The Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia used to have at least 51 confirmed deaths on its official record. Well, sadly, one survivor told us he was not surprised to find out at least 215 more students were found buried there.
Sometimes kids would not show up in classroom. They would disappear for the next day, and we knew that they were gone, but we didn't know where they were gone.
Gary Gottfriedson is a survivor of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. He's among the thousands of Indigenous peoples legally mandated by the Canadian government to attend such institutions. They were set up in the late 1800s and often operated by the Catholic Church.
A disturbing discovery in Ireland. A mass grave of children has been found at a site that was once a Catholic orphanage. 3 years ago, a local historian investigated and found death certificates for nearly 800 children who died at the orphanage from 1925 to 1961. This week, forensics officials confirmed those findings. Nuns ran the home where thousands of unmarried mothers were forced to stay as punishment. Many of the women were able to leave after serving their time. Their children were left behind.
Now to Canada, where horrors from a different era have returned to haunt the country. Another mass grave of children has been unearthed, school children. And this is the third one since May. 182 unmarked graves have been found in British Columbia. More than 1,000 mass graves have been found in Canada. The findings have led to an angry backlash. But neither the Justin Trudeau government nor the Catholic Church wants to take responsibility.
6 years on from the discovery of 800 babies' bodies in sewage tanks under a former mother and baby home in the Irish town of Tuam, and a state commission to investigate what really happened still has yet to report. But Tuam seems to be the tip of the iceberg. This is Sean Ross Abbey. Like all such homes, women who'd become pregnant out of marriage were ordered to come here.
Oh, God, it's huge.
This is your first impression when you walk in.
It's like a stately home.
And surrender their babies to the nuns for adoption, while they were made to work in the laundries as a punishment for their sins.
Turned over the sod and I just noticed lots of small bones.
The nuns claim 269 babies died here, the last in 1994. Yet official records say the actual figure is over 1,000. So where are they? We've established the existence of a burial pit for unbaptised children whose deaths aren't recorded anywhere, and it's believed a sewage tank has been laid in the Angels plot as well. It's an echo of what happened at Tuam. At another home, Bessborough, a confidential Irish Health Service document showed just how many infants died in the care of the nuns. In 1 year, the death rate was 82%. 900 babies died here, yet only 64 are recorded. The nuns say they can't remember where the rest are, but this official map suggests the existence of a children's burial plot right here. You can see the indentations from the air.
I don't believe for 1 second they don't know where the burial grounds are, and I don't believe for 1 second that they don't have full records of everything that happened in those places.
We came across a workman who'd been asked to dig up the site right next to where the graves appear to be.
Are you worried about taking here?
He had no way of knowing, but for the relatives of those who died here, it amounts to tampering with a potential crime scene.
Just so you know, it's an area under question.
For the relatives, the idea that the remains of thousands of children are scattered around Ireland shouldn't really be a matter for a civil commission of inquiry at all. It should be something for these people, the police.
There were 14 mother and baby homes in Ireland. Our investigation has raised concerns about a number of them, but by no means all. The Irish State Commission has an opportunity to reveal the truth about what happened throughout the 20th century, with all the implicit criticism of the role of the Catholic Church in society. Whether it will remains an open question until it decides to release its own findings.
Indigenous groups in Canada are searching nationwide for more graves after a second discovery at a residential school last week. Officials found at least 600 unmarked graves at a former school for Indigenous children. This comes less than a month after officials found the bodies of 215 children buried at another school in British Columbia. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has vowed to dedicate resources to bringing these terrible wrongs to light. For more on this, I want to bring in Marie Wilson. She's a former commissioner for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Marie, welcome. Thank you for joining us. So talk to us about the history of these schools and what conditions were like for the children there.
Well, I think in a short version, the residential schools were part of Canada's plan to expand into the West, and to assimilate and Christianize the Indigenous peoples who were already occupying all these lands, and who were seen in a way to be obstacles to the progress that the country envisioned. And so residential schools for Indigenous children were put into law, Canadian law, in the late 1800s. There actually were some schools that were operating under the churches before that. And the last schools closed in 1996. So this was government policy for over 100 years. And it means that there were some 7 generations of Indigenous children who went through the schools, and under duress, really, because while they wanted to have education for their children, they had not imagined that the children would be taken far away from home, and that they would lose control of them as parents and be unable to protect them or supervise them, and therefore the children lived and experienced great harms. And that's what led to the creation of our Truth and Reconciliation Commission back in 2008.
Well, of course, now we know that graves have been discovered at 2 schools so far. Do you think that this means there are more graves that have yet to be discovered?
Well, it absolutely does. And one of the things that's very important to know is that in Canada, we had our Truth and Reconciliation Commission because there were still 80,000 living survivors of the residential schools at the time. And they took the government and the 4 national churches who ran the schools to court over the harms that they had experienced as children. And during our work, we had our commission function for 6.5 years. We recorded thousands of statements, and many of those talked about children who had died at the schools, things that they had witnessed by way of extreme abuses, children who had disappeared, in some cases, graves that they had been compelled to help dig. So we already knew that there were many deaths in schools, and indeed our work, even though our mandate did not include missing or lost children, we did it anyway because it kept coming up in the statements we were receiving from the survivors. And so we had already recorded 3,200 children who died in the schools, and we were aware of 1,000 others who died within the first year having gone home. But what we also said, and if I may just refer to Volume 4 of our report, basically talked about unfinished business. And it said that there was a huge amount of work yet to be done to find all of these missing children, because we knew that 3,000 to 4,000 was a very conservative estimate. And now what we are finding, some are calling it a discovery. What I've said repeatedly is no, it's an affirmation. It's a validation of everything that we have been told over and over again. And for whatever reason, we've chosen not to listen until now.
Right. These children were missing, and now we are discovering graves. So what is the process like of trying to, identify who these children are in these graves and bringing some closure to their families who obviously, at this point, they might be descendants, but at least who deserve to know who are in these graves and what the fate of their family members was?
Right. Well, I think the first thing is to know that we haven't found all the children yet. There were over close to 150 residential school sites, and we know that some of the burials happened not at the school sites. As we reported in our report, many of the places where there were graves are now have fallen into private hands. And so there's complicated jurisdictional work to be done on getting access to lands that are now in private hands. There are multi-levels of government involved, municipalities, provinces, and territories, which are like your states. and of course the federal government, but there are also extremely diverse protocols within and among and between the Indigenous peoples who are affected here. You can't just assume that if a discovery is made in a certain community, that that community is the only one affected. Children were sent sometimes thousands of miles away to go to schools. And so their remains may be among those that are now being revealed. And it may not be the wish or indeed the practice of their particular nation to do exhumations, for example. So the work of identifying is going to be extremely important. There's absolute need that the documents that have not all been forthcoming be forthcoming so that we can do the cross-referencing to try to figure out whether deaths belong to certain families. We also know that many names were changed by the church. And so certain names that may be listed may not be recognized by the communities because the names have died out or because the names are so altered from what they originally were. And finally, just the sheer number of it all, we just have to know that this is going to be long, painful work, but it is essential work and it's barely begun.
It is essential work. And Marie Wilson, we thank you so much for everything that you are doing to bring these truths to light and for joining us today to talk about it.
May I just say, though, especially for the viewers in the United States, it's a cautionary tale in a way for you as well. And because Canada knew these things and either ignored or didn't pay attention. In the United States, there's been extremely important work done by the American Boarding School Coalition. And I think your country needs to be bracing itself for the possibility that there will be similar experiences in the United States. And so to pay attention to that work as well as it unfolds.
Absolutely. Marie, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for your ongoing interest. Much appreciated.